Hello there, welcome to the channel, Loving Life on Less. This video is part 2 of my grandma's frugal living tips. If you'd like to watch part 1 of the video, I'll pop a link in the comments underneath. Just a quick recap, my grandma was born in Goole, which is East Yorkshire, in 1919. It was just after World War I, and she went on to bring up 4 children almost single-handedly during World War II. She was very poor and hardworking, becoming a frowned-upon single mother when her husband walked out in the 1950s. Unfortunately, my granddad, who had served in the Second World War, came back from service with shell shock and couldn't cope with family life. Things must have been quite bad at one point, as my nana, who had 2 big brothers that had also served in the war, had to have a word with my granddad about how he was treating the family. But to no avail. There wasn't the same treatments for shell shock and therapies and understanding that there is now, and unfortunately, the family fell apart, with my granddad choosing to leave in the mid-50s. From that point onwards, my grandma now became a single mum of 4 young children. She worked hard as a meter maid during the day while the children were at school, and when they came home, she would make sure they were fed and loved and looked after and put to bed. My mum and her siblings always remembered my nana as being very busy and frequently very tired, but still soldiering on. I was very fortunate as her granddaughter that spent a lot of time with her in my childhood in the 70s and 80s and 90s, that the pressure of a war, of bringing up small children single-handedly, of working and worrying about the bills had gone. So I could have quality time with my nana. She taught me so much about being frugal and careful with money. Being a child in the after effects of the First World War and living through the Second World War, being frugal and prudent was ingrained within my nana's personality, and she just did it naturally. It was all about not wasting. It was about reusing and being resourceful. Those skills will get us through tough times, and the best thing, those skills can be learned. So let's get straight into the kitchen front with my grandma's frugal living tips. If you have watched part 1 of the video, you may remember how important tea was to my grandma. She would have cups of tea from the moment she got up until she went to sleep. She was never a coffee drinker, but she did always have a bottle of camp coffee, which is made from chicory, in her kitchen cupboards, and she would say that was for male visitors that preferred coffee. If the camp coffee was coming out, so was usually the best china. In the 1970s, when I was around her house, she would always have a jar of coffee called Mellow Birds for visitors. She would use the jar of Mellow Birds to pop a couple of teaspoons in into a cake mix to make a coffee cake for extra special occasions. She baked a lot of her own sweet treats and goods in the 70s, and I would watch her as she very carefully would use lard or butter and always kept the piece of paper from the pat of butter to use to wipe around the baking trays. When making jam tarts or lemon curds, a very small 3/4 of a teaspoon of jam or lemon curd was pushed into the bottom of each pastry for cooking. They were never overfilled, as the conserves were such a sweet treat you wouldn't waste them by being greedy. Her meals were a lot smaller than what we have today. For example, an evening meal could quite easily be half a tin of soup with a slice of cheese on toast, and maybe a tinned pear to finish with. When we were children, she would give us mashed potato covered in half a tin of soup if we'd been poorly. It was usually tomato soup, as my grandma believed that all that vitamin C would give us the boost back to health that we needed. Tinned fruit and evaporated milk were also a treat, and the small tins of evaporated milk she would puncture twice, one at each side of the tin, so the milk flowed freely. However, the hole was never too big because it couldn't flow too freely. That would have been a waste. She also had what I call a staple tin opener, which has the sharp point which you stick into the tin and jag round. I actually learnt as a 9-year-old, with my nana stood over me, how to use one of these tin openers, and nowadays we still always have one in the cupboard because it has lasted for 30 years, and we use it as a backup tin opener because modern tin openers just don't seem to last quite like these old staple tin openers. My nana knew how to make food go a long way. She always had tins of pilchards or sardines in the cupboard and would make fish cakes or fish pie, or we'd have sardines on toast. I don't remember her having tuna in her cupboard, but I do remember her having quite a large tin of salmon, which was only to be used on very special occasions, such as Boxing Day. My nana always had a good selection of tins in the cupboard, and it's almost like she was an early prepper, having experienced the war, realising that it was important to have tins and dried stores in the cupboard just in case. In 1939, the UK government had said, as an ordinary householder, you will be doing a good service if you can manage some extra stores of food that will keep. They had suggested tinned meat and fish, flour, sugar, suet, milk, tea, cocoa, and plain biscuits. If I added bacon and butter to that list, those items would be my nana's staples, even in the 1970s and 80s. During the war, the concept changed, and it was said if you had more than anybody else, it would be unfair. And that was the backbone of rationing. Everyone should have equal supplies. My nana preferred white bread. Sometimes she would buy it and sometimes she would bake it. It always had to be white bread, as she really disliked brown bread, and this stemmed back to the national bread during the war. This was bread that most of the population was given, and in this bread, 90% of the wheat husk was used, of course, because they didn't waste anything, so the bread was grainy and meant to be quite tough. And from the 1950s to the early 1980s, white bread was really back in fashion because of the memories of the national bread. But then we know wholemeal bread and brown breads became a lot more popular once again. In 1942, the average person had 29 eggs a year. That's about one per fortnight. And for this reason, my nana really valued eggs. When she cooked with them, it was usually as a whole egg, and we would have them fried with a runny yolk or boiled with a runny yolk, soldiers, and a little bit of salt. It's almost like an egg was a luxury product. When baking, she would use the odd egg, but she would stretch it out by whisking in milk. The same if she was browning pastry, she'd use a little bit of milk on top. She would never waste an egg. Cheese was also very carefully used. She could make one small block of cheddar cheese last 2 or 3 weeks. She would wrap the cheese in foil and keep in her fridge to keep the mould off. But if she did ever open the cheese and there was mould on the cheese, it would just be cut off, a bit of mould, and the cheese would be used as normal. You never wasted food. Outside cabbage leaves, which we would now discard, would be put in the pot to make soup. And the tops of radishes, when she'd grown radishes, wouldn't be thrown away. They'd be popped in a soup or put in sandwiches. So much money can be saved in the kitchen, from reducing energy to meal planning and using up all food before it expires. In the house and around the house, everything was used, reused, and never wasted. From the make, do, and mend of Mrs. So-and-so, who was again a wartime creation, to encourage housewives to repair clothes and make new clothes out of old clothes, and of course the term make, do, and mend itself, which has roared back into fashion these last few years. My grandma taught me how to sew, and we had many enjoyable times together sewing. I was also very excited by her button tin. It was an old toffee tin, and it was filled with all odd buttons and toggles and hooks. And some of these buttons were fantastic. Some of them had like little pictures of ladybirds on the back from when she'd been knitting children's cardigans. Others were great big brown buttons that had come off skirts. There were so many different buttons there, and she was carrying that mindset through from when she was a younger woman. You didn't waste buttons, you saved them. One day you could use those buttons and they could come in handy. And very often she would actually replace buttons on shirts and trousers and school skirts. I can remember her doing my school skirt when a button had come off. In that huge button tin, there was always a suitable button for every job. But the best thing about the button tin was playing in it. My grandma was also, when it came to textiles and fabrics, very moth aware. And there was a big fight the moth campaign during the Second World War about protecting your clothes from moths. We don't seem to have that much issue these days with moths attacking clothes. And I can only put that down to one thing, I'm assuming. Is it because we don't have so many natural fabrics now? Many of our clothes are sort of acrylics and polyesters and things like that. And I'm sure the moths don't find them pleasant. My nana and then my mum would knit blankets, and with odd bits and scraps of wool, blankets could be made by knitting small squares and then stitching them together. These are actually my mum's creations. She made a couple of years ago, and she pops them on the bed now. They are fantastic for in between weathers when you're not too hot and you're not too cold, but it's a great way of using up scraps of wool. Up until the 80s, my grandma had a carpet sweeper, which was a manual sweeper, which she'd push across the carpet and it would collect up bits and scraps and hairs and things. And she'd clean it out once a week, having to clean the bar that went round. In the 80s, she bought a small second-hand Hoover, but most of the time she did prefer to get the carpet sweeper out or even a sweeping brush to brush over the carpets. You never wore shoes in her house, it was always slippers to protect the longevity of the carpets. Also, when she did have a carpet fitted, which wouldn't be very often because they were so well looked after, the cut-offs from the carpet were never thrown away. They were either used as a runner mat for the back door or the front door, again to protect carpets from shoes, or they'd be made into mats. She liked to have a mat to stand on while she was washing the pots at the kitchen sink. And I think that was to add an extra layer of warmth when stood on a cold tiled floor, so she couldn't feel the cold travelling up her slippers into her legs. When I was very little, she had the Eisel toilet roll, which is the paper toilet roll. It was shiny and hard, and it almost felt like greaseproof paper. I can remember complaining about it to my nana, and she was saying that I ought to have tried newspaper, which what they'd had to use when they was kids. In the 80s, she eventually started buying the soft sheet tissue paper, and because it was expensive in her mind, we did get perma reminders not to use a lot. However, she never went back to the paper toilet rolls, even though, for frugality, it would have been a lot cheaper. Grandmas and nanas always seem to have time for hugs. They have the wisdom of patience, and I think very often truly know how to listen, whereas parents may be so busy and caught up in the stresses and pressures of the day. When you're young, you don't recognise those times as the most precious times, and soon they become a hazy memory that fills your soul with warmth and yet a tinge of sadness. And my very favourite times with my nana were when we were sat bonding, watching the television together or playing games together. She really loved an American television sitcom called The Golden Girls, which was of 4 sassy older ladies making their way through life. I think she really admired them and aspired to be like them, feeling unglamorous, compared to these Miami living ladies who seemed to have everything, including the same problems as my nana. They were just dressed a little better. And once a week, she would buy the local newspaper and she would sit me down and she would turn to the page where there was a game called Spot the Ball. And we would sit next to each other and you had to put little crosses on a picture of a football pitch where you think the ball was. Then you would send off your entry, and the next week, the person whose entry was closest, the cross to where the football was, would win a monetary prize. We used to really enjoy doing this together, and we both sit there with a cup of tea and decide where we thought the best place to place the cross was. We never won, but it was something we did once a week, every week, and it was very special to me. I was also allowed to get out her tea set and play tea parties using water and a packet of nice biscuits. She always had a packet of nice biscuits. Rarely did she buy anything as exotic as chocolate digestives because they were just so expensive compared to the plain biscuits. And always as a teenager, when I seemed a bit loggerheads with my mum, my nana was always there and on my side. She never tried to interfere with the way my mum was bringing me up, but she did always have that softer side that being older and more understanding can bring. And very often, when my mum wasn't looking, my nana might slide a £1 note into my hand and say, "Don't tell your mum." And I never did. But my mum might know now, because she sometimes watches these videos too. My grandma used to say that the kitchen was where she won her personal war, and with a resourceful attitude and 4 kids to feed and a husband away, she certainly managed to do that and bring forward those wisdoms well into my lifetime. When I smell lavender on the wind, or I can smell buttermints, I always think of my nana. I have such warm and fond memories of her. She had a hard life, and she managed to still be warm and loving and compassionate and always available for a hug. If you've ever had a grandma or a mum that's always available for a hug, I think it's one of the greatest blessings there is. There are some amazing, frugal, make, do and mend granddads and dads and brothers and uncles historically and still out there. And they have many different aspects of how to save money, reuse things, make things, and mend things, which are still vital to know and great wisdoms to be passed on. David was very fortunate to have a wonderful father who taught him so much. So we're going to do a video and pay accolades too to those fantastic male role models that we've had in our life that have taught us skills, that have given us wisdoms, and helped us be prepared for all eventualities. Thank you for listening today. We hope you liked the video. If you do like our content, please subscribe and like, and we'll be back again very soon. Wherever you are in the world, we hope you have a wonderful day. Bye for now.